Introduction. We often view our ability to steer our focus, temper our reactions, and guide our cravings as the ultimate determinant of our life's trajectory. It is widely understood that this capacity profoundly impacts our physical vitality, financial stability, and the richness of our relationships. We recognize the inherent necessity of being the masters of our own ship, responsible for every word spoken, every dollar spent, and every habit indulged. Yet, a profound paradox exists within the human experience. While we hold this ideal of absolute self-mastery, we frequently find ourselves adrift. Many of us navigate an exhausting pendulum swing between periods of disciplined control and moments of complete surrender to our impulses. The burden of this constant vigilance can be incredibly draining, leaving individuals feeling guilty, overwhelmed, and dictated by fleeting urges rather than deliberate intentions. Through years of guiding individuals toward healthier choices and observing the intense struggle to alter ingrained thoughts and behaviors, it becomes evident that conventional wisdom regarding self-discipline is deeply flawed. The strategies most people instinctively turn to are not just unhelpful, they are actively destructive, perpetuating a cycle of frustration, unnecessary stress, and inevitable self-sabotage. This widespread suffering birthed a unique educational pursuit, a curriculum designed to synthesize the latest discoveries across psychology, economics, neuroscience, and medicine. The goal was to dismantle outdated myths and provide a rigorous, science-backed framework for understanding exactly why we succumb to temptation and how we can genuinely fortify our resolve. The overwhelming response from individuals across all walks of life, from executives to parents to recovering addicts, revealed a shared, desperate hunger for practical, evidence-based tools. They sought not just to break bad habits or conquer procrastination, but to fundamentally understand their own behavior and reclaim a sense of agency over their lives. While countless guides exist to help establish aspirations and delineate the steps to achieve them, merely identifying a destination is never enough to guarantee arrival. If setting intentions were the sole requirement for meaningful change, abandoned resolutions would be a thing of the past, and the struggle for self-mastery would not be a universal human condition. True enhancement of one's self-discipline requires a courageous and unflinching examination of the mechanics of personal failure. Understanding the precise vulnerabilities, rationalizations, and traps that lead to a loss of resolve does not, as many fear, invite defeat. Rather, it provides the essential architecture for success. Curiously, psychological research reveals that those who profess the highest confidence in their own willpower are often the most susceptible to its collapse. Unbridled optimism creates a perilous blind spot, preventing individuals from anticipating the specific circumstances, emotional states, and environmental triggers that will inevitably test their limits. By failing to foresee these moments, they inadvertently position themselves directly in the path of temptation and are easily derailed by inevitable setbacks. Therefore, the bedrock of authentic self-mastery is an intimate, unvarnished familiarity with one's own behavioral pitfalls. Each step forward must involve dissecting our missteps, acting as a compassionate investigator of our own human frailty. By understanding the fatal errors in our thinking and behavior, conducting a kind of autopsy on our moments of weakness, we can construct proactive strategies to shield our future selves from predictable downfalls. Ultimately, recognizing that the struggle against impulse and distraction is a universally shared human condition can alleviate the profound shame that so often accompanies these challenges, transforming perceived personal inadequacies into a foundation for profound, lasting transformation. Theoretical knowledge, while valuable, must always yield to the rigorous test of personal experience. Thus, the journey toward heightened self-discipline must be approached not with blind faith in abstract concepts, but with the inquisitive, objective mindset of a dedicated researcher. The real-world laboratory of daily life is where these principles must be scrutinized. As new insights regarding the mechanics of human behavior are presented, they demand active testing. The first phase of this empirical approach involves acute, non-judgmental observation. Before attempting to alter any deeply ingrained pattern, one must first clearly perceive it in its natural state. This requires stepping back and observing the emotional triggers that precipitate a loss of control, the internal dialogue that seamlessly rationalizes procrastination, and the subtle environmental cues that quietly weaken resolve. This observation must be conducted without the heavy burden of self-criticism, replacing the instinct to reprimand oneself with profound, detached curiosity. Following this meticulous observation comes the phase of active experimentation. Practical, scientifically grounded strategies must be introduced into the daily routine. These are not rigid, universal mandates, but flexible hypotheses to be tested. Some techniques will resonate deeply and yield immediate results. Others may prove ineffective for a particular individual's unique psychological makeup. The objective is to gather personal data, discerning which specific interventions genuinely fortify one's capacity to pause, reflect, and choose wisely amidst the clamor of competing desires. To derive the maximum benefit from this exploration, it is essential to anchor the theoretical concepts to a concrete, deeply personal objective. Every individual harbors unique battles of the will. While some confront the primal biological urges for immediate caloric gratification, others wrestle with the modern compulsions of digital distraction, the allure of impulsive spending, or the heavy inertia of chronic procrastination. Despite the incredibly diverse nature of these specific struggles, the underlying psychological and neurological architecture remains remarkably consistent. The internal conflict of someone yearning for a cigarette closely mirrors the tension of an individual avoiding a critical professional task or struggling to maintain patience with a child. Therefore, it is necessary to identify a singular focus for this journey, a positive habit to cultivate, a detrimental pattern to eradicate, or a significant long-term aspiration requiring sustained energy. By applying these scientific principles to a specific, tangible goal, the abstract concepts transform into actionable instruments of change, illuminating the universal nature of impulse control. The acquisition of deep self-mastery is not a hasty endeavor, but a gradual, iterative process of discovery and application. The insights and techniques are structured to build upon one another, creating a comprehensive framework for behavioral change. While the temptation may exist to rush through the concepts, true integration requires patience and deliberate pacing. Allocating dedicated time to observe how a specific psychological mechanism operates within one's own life before attempting to implement a counter-strategy is crucial for sustained success. Attempting to overhaul multiple habits simultaneously is a proven recipe for cognitive exhaustion and eventual surrender. Instead, the most effective path involves integrating a single, relevant strategy at a time, allowing it to become a naturalized part of one's routine before advancing to the next challenge. The initial step, therefore, is to firmly establish the primary arena for this endeavor. One must actively determine whether the focus will be an action requiring deliberate initiation, a deeply ingrained behavior demanding cessation, or a profound, overarching aspiration that consistently falls victim to momentary, conflicting desires. With this specific, personal objective clearly defined and held firmly in mind, the profound exploration into the origins, limits, and potential of our self-directed strength can truly commence.
Chapter 1. 1. I will, I won't, I want. What willpower is and why it matters. When contemplating the concept of willpower, the mind typically gravitates toward the struggle against temptation. The quintessential trial of self-discipline often involves denying oneself a sweet indulgence, a destructive habit, or an impulsive purchase. In popular parlance, lacking willpower simply means failing to say no when our deepest physical or emotional desires scream for a yes. We can conceptualize this resistance as the power of I won't. However, the ability to deny oneself is merely one facet of a much broader capacity. Sometimes the greater challenge is finding the strength to say yes. For all the tasks perpetually relegated to tomorrow, willpower is the force that propels them onto today's agenda, overriding the seductive whispers of anxiety, distraction, or endless entertainment. This driving force is the power of I will, the sheer determination to execute necessary actions despite profound internal resistance. Yet these two forces, I will and I won't, are insufficient on their own. To effectively deploy them, one must harness a third, overarching capability, the profound remembrance of what one truly desires. While the immediate craving might be a decadent dessert or a day of idle leisure, true willpower requires holding fast to the ultimate objective, whether that entails vibrant health, professional advancement, or relational harmony. Without this anchoring motivation, there is nothing to prevent the surrender to fleeting impulses. This ability to recall core motivations in the heat of temptation is the power of I want. True self-mastery involves orchestrating these three distinct powers, I will, I won't, and I want, to navigate life's challenges. As we shall explore, the human brain is uniquely equipped to support these capacities, and their development is arguably the defining characteristic of our species. To comprehend the origins of willpower, we must venture back roughly 100,000 years. Imagine an early human ancestor navigating a relatively simple existence defined by the pursuit of sustenance, the drive to reproduce, and the desperate need to avoid becoming a predator's meal. Yet survival was inherently collective. This dependence on the tribe necessitated an additional layer of complexity, maintaining social harmony. Living in close-knit communities meant that resources had to be shared and impulses curtailed. Taking another's food or mate could result in exile or death. Therefore, the rules of social survival demanded cooperation, generosity, and restraint, even when primitive urges dictated otherwise. Furthermore, ensuring the tribe's genetic health required selective mating rather than indiscriminate procreation. As social structures grew increasingly intricate, the evolutionary pressure for self-control intensified. Our brains adapted to these demands, developing the neurological architecture that allows us to regulate the very appetites and aggressive instincts that originally ensured our survival. In the modern era, while the specific threats have evolved, the importance of this neurological upgrade cannot be overstated. Willpower is no longer just the trait that separates humans from animals. It is the primary factor that distinguishes individuals from one another. The capacity to master attention, regulate emotion, and control behavior correlates with almost every measure of a successful life. Those who possess strong self-discipline enjoy better physical health, greater financial security, and more enduring, satisfying relationships. They excel in their professions, manage stress more effectively, and demonstrate remarkable resilience in the face of adversity. Strikingly, self-control eclipses other highly prized attributes. It outpaces intelligence in predicting academic achievement, surpasses charisma as a hallmark of leadership, and outweighs empathy in fostering marital stability. Enhancing one's self-discipline is, therefore, the most direct route to elevating the overall quality of life. This extraordinary capacity for self-regulation is rooted in a specific region of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. For much of human history, this area primarily governed physical movement. However, as our species evolved, the prefrontal cortex expanded and forged intricate connections with other neural regions, assuming control over attention, thought, and emotion. Modern neuroscience suggests that the primary function of this enlarged prefrontal cortex is to incline the brain, and by extension the individual, toward the more difficult path. When the path of least resistance involves remaining sedentary, indulging in excess, or deferring important tasks, the prefrontal cortex intervenes, championing exercise, restraint, and immediate action. This region is functionally divided to manage the three core powers of willpower. The upper left quadrant specializes in I willpower, providing the stamina to initiate and sustain arduous tasks. The right side governs I won't power, acting as a brake against impulsive actions and cravings. Finally, a lower, central region maintains the crucial I want power, diligently tracking long-term goals and desires, even when the rest of the brain clamors for instant gratification. To deeply grasp the necessity of doing the harder thing, it is vital to apply these concepts to a personal challenge. Every test of willpower inherently demands an action that feels exceptionally difficult, whether that means retreating from a powerful temptation or confronting a deeply stressful obligation. By examining one's specific struggle, acknowledging what makes the required action so arduous, and observing the emotional resistance it provokes, the abstract mechanics of the prefrontal cortex become intimately real. The indispensable role of the prefrontal cortex becomes terrifyingly apparent when it is suddenly lost. Consider the tragic, real-world case from the mid-19th century involving a robust, well-respected railroad foreman. Known for his exceptional physical and mental fortitude, this young man's life was forever altered when an explosive accident drove a heavy iron rod directly through his skull, obliterating his left prefrontal cortex. Miraculously, he survived the trauma and quickly recovered his physical strength. However, his personality underwent a profound and chilling transformation.
The quiet, respectful leader was replaced by a volatile, deeply profane individual, utterly incapable of restraint and prone to abandoning plans as quickly as he formed them. With the destruction of his prefrontal cortex, his I will, I won't, and I want powers vanished completely. While such catastrophic injuries are rare, minor and temporary impairments of this brain region are common. States of intoxication, severe sleep deprivation, or profound distraction can temporarily inhibit the prefrontal cortex, inducing a mild version of this same neurological deficit and leaving us highly vulnerable to our impulses. Even with a fully functioning, well-rested prefrontal cortex, the battle for self-control is rarely easy. This enduring struggle is another legacy of evolution. As the human brain expanded, the newer architecture of self-control did not replace the primitive systems governing primal urges. It was simply layered on top. Consequently, instincts that once ensured survival, such as the intense craving for calorie-dense foods, persist fiercely today, despite being entirely maladaptive in an environment of endless abundance. The modern brain retains a powerful drive for immediate gratification, necessitating constant intervention from the newer, self-regulating regions to prevent disastrous overindulgence. This neurological layering creates the sensation of harboring two distinct minds, or even two separate entities, within a single body. One self is intensely focused on immediate pleasure, while the other is dedicated to long-term preservation. A willpower challenge is essentially a clash between these two internal perspectives. Recognizing the existence of these two competing selves is a critical step toward mastery. When facing a personal challenge, it is immensely helpful to clearly define the conflicting desires. What does the impulsive facet demand, and what does the wiser, forward-looking facet truly value? By assigning distinct identities to these internal voices, perhaps visualizing the impulsive side as a relentless consumer of instant gratification or a chronic avoider of effort, one can more easily detect when the primitive mind is attempting a coup and immediately summon the higher self for reinforcement. It is a profound mistake, however, to view the self-control system as unequivocally superior and the primitive instincts as entirely detrimental. Survival depends on the interplay of both. Individuals who have lost access to primal emotions like fear or disgust through brain injury exhibit appallingly poor judgment, engaging in gluttonous and highly inappropriate behaviors because they lack the instinctual aversions that naturally regulate conduct. In many scenarios, our primitive drives and our prefrontal cortex work in remarkable synergy. For instance, the sudden perception of an exorbitant price tag can trigger an instinctual pain response in the brain, instantly suppressing the desire to make an impulsive purchase without requiring immense cognitive effort. The ultimate aim is not to eradicate our basic human nature, but to harness all our instincts, including our desires for pleasure and social belonging, in service of our highest aspirations. The bedrock of utilizing this complex neural machinery lies in a distinctly human trait, self-awareness. Without the ability to consciously monitor our thoughts, emotions, and actions, the self-control system remains dormant. The brain defaults to the easiest, most deeply ingrained habits. To break a destructive pattern, one must first recognize the earliest physiological and psychological signs of an impending lapse, foresee the inevitable negative consequences, and consciously choose a different trajectory. Unfortunately, modern life is characterized by endless stimulation and chronic distraction, plunging us into a state of perpetual autopilot. When the mind is preoccupied, perhaps by composing a digital message or ruminating on professional anxieties, decision-making falls entirely to our impulsive instincts rather than our long-term goals, rendering us highly susceptible to every passing temptation. Cultivating self-awareness requires deliberate practice. A powerful initial exercise involves meticulously tracking every decision related to a specific personal goal over the course of a single day. Many critical choices occur beneath the threshold of conscious thought. Some decisions are overt, but the impact of subtle, earlier choices, such as whether to prepare for an activity in advance or allow a delay to sabotage the entire plan, often goes unnoticed until the damage is done. By reviewing the day's events and isolating these pivotal moments, the sheer act of monitoring drastically reduces the number of decisions made while distracted, automatically bolstering overall resolve. Consider the experience of a professional whose habitual engagement with digital communications severely compromised both her productivity and her personal life. She initially failed to curb her usage because the impulse to check her devices operated entirely outside her conscious awareness. By shifting her focus from simply restricting the behavior to acutely observing the exact moment the impulse arose, she made a profound discovery. The urge manifested as a distinct physical tension, a psychological itch that checking her messages briefly relieved, only to exacerbate the underlying anxiety. This vital insight, recognizing the behavior as a flawed coping mechanism for tension rather than a genuine quest for information, granted her the necessary distance to interrupt the cycle, proving that profound self-awareness must precede any lasting behavioral shift. Remarkably, the brain's architecture is not fixed. It is highly malleable and responsive to training. Engaging the brain in specific cognitive tasks actually alters its physical structure, increasing the density of gray matter and improving neural connectivity. Just as physical exercise strengthens muscles, targeted mental exercises can fortify the neural pathways responsible for self-control. One of the most potent methods for achieving this neurological remodeling is the practice of meditation. Regular meditation profoundly enhances attention, focus, and impulse control by increasing blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. Over time, the brains of those who meditate become highly efficient instruments of self-regulation, demonstrating measurable growth in the areas associated with self-awareness and disciplined action. Even brief daily sessions can yield significant changes in a remarkably short period. A foundational technique involves simply sitting still and directing unwavering attention to the breath. This requires maintaining physical immobility, resisting the urge to adjust posture or scratch an itch, which serves as a powerful primer for controlling deeper impulses. The mental practice involves silently noting each inhalation and exhalation, and when the mind inevitably wanders, gently returning focus to the rhythm of breathing. This repetitive act of noticing distraction and redirecting attention fundamentally exercises the prefrontal cortex while quieting the brain's stress and craving centers. As proficiency grows, the silent labels can be dropped, allowing the practitioner to focus purely on the physical sensation of the breath, further refining both self-awareness and focus. It is crucial to understand that struggling with focus during this practice is not a sign of failure. It is the very essence of the training. When a practitioner feels frustrated by a wandering mind, they are entirely missing the point. The objective is not to achieve an impossibly empty mind, but to master the act of recognizing a deviation from the goal and successfully redirecting attention back to the target. This internal process perfectly mirrors the real-world application of willpower, catching oneself in the midst of an impulsive thought or action and consciously choosing to realign with a higher purpose. A meditation session filled with countless distractions is, in fact, an immensely valuable workout, providing numerous opportunities to practice the exact mental maneuver required to overcome daily temptations. Ultimately, our existence is characterized by a continuous internal dialogue among competing desires. Every challenge to our resolve is a manifestation of this profound internal architecture. By deeply understanding the distinct powers of I will, I won't, and I want, and by rigorously training the biological systems that support them through focused self-awareness and deliberate mental exercise, we can elevate our higher selves, ensuring that our choices are guided by our deepest values rather than our fleeting impulses.
Chapter 2. The Willpower Instinct. Your body was born to resist cheesecake. The experience of craving often begins as an electric surge of anticipation. A sudden rush of energy floods the chest, accompanied by a rapid heartbeat and a dizzying sensation of desire. But this initial thrill is frequently chased by a tightening grip of anxiety. The lungs constrict, muscles become taut, and a distinct, almost nauseating tension takes hold. It is a visceral tug-of-war, the desperate yearning for something against the frantic inner plea for restraint. This is the physiological reality of facing temptation, whether the object of desire is a cigarette, a decadent dessert, or an impulsive purchase. When we are caught in this crossfire, the battle is not merely a philosophical debate. It is a physical sensation of being torn in half. Success or failure in these moments can feel frustratingly arbitrary, yet the mechanism behind our ability to resist or our tendency to succumb is deeply rooted in our biology. True self-mastery relies on a temporary, coordinated state of the brain and body that cultivates the necessary calm to overcome destructive urges. Recognizing how this physiological state operates and understanding why the complexities of modern existence frequently disrupt it allows us to intentionally harness our biological capacity for restraint. A tale of two threats. To grasp the mechanics of our internal defenses, it is essential to distinguish between the distinct nature of modern temptations and ancient perils. While a sugary dessert and a predatory beast might both ultimately threaten our longevity, they demand entirely different survival strategies. The human organism has evolved sophisticated yet highly specific mechanisms to counter both the external threats of our ancestral past and the internal conflicts of our present reality. When danger strikes, imagine traversing the treacherous landscapes of our early evolutionary history, where survival meant constantly evading lethal predators. If a sudden, deadly threat, such as a large, hungry carnivore, appeared on the horizon, the body's response had to be instantaneous and absolute. This ancient survival mechanism is known as the fight-or-flight response. The moment a threat is perceived, the brain's alarm center triggers a massive cascade of neurological and physiological changes designed solely to preserve life in the immediate seconds. Stress hormones flood the system. Liver stores dump energy-rich sugars and fats into the blood, and the cardiovascular system accelerates to pump this fuel directly to the muscles required for combat or escape. Simultaneously, the brain orchestrates a hyper-focus on the external danger while deliberately suppressing the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for deliberate, long-term planning and impulse control. In a life-or-death scenario, hesitation or overthinking is fatal. The fight-or-flight response is an exquisite energy management system, forcefully redirecting all available physical and mental resources away from non-essential functions like digestion or future planning, and channeling them entirely into immediate instinctive action. A new kind of threat. Now, contrast this primal emergency with a distinctly modern peril, encountering an irresistible dessert in a bakery window. Upon laying eyes on this sugary confection, the brain does not register danger. It anticipates a profound reward. A rush of dopamine acts as a siren call, demanding immediate consumption and driving the body toward the temptation. To prepare for the incoming onslaught of sugar, the body preemptively drops its blood sugar levels, which paradoxically intensifies the craving and leaves the individual feeling shaky and desperate. Unlike the predatory beast, the dessert poses no external immediate threat to life. It only becomes dangerous if one actively chooses to consume it. The enemy is entirely internal. Therefore, the fight-or-flight response, which prepares the body for physical exertion and suppresses rational thought, is the absolute worst state to be in when facing a bakery display. Fleeing in panic or attacking the pastry is unnecessary and absurd. What is required is a biological response that defends the self against its own detrimental impulses. Under the microscope. What is the threat? We are culturally conditioned to view temptations as external entities, the cigarette, the internet, the dessert, as if the danger resides within the object itself. True self-mastery, however, requires turning the lens inward. The genuine threat is the internal impulse, the specific craving or emotional trigger that demands gratification at the expense of long-term well-being. By closely observing our own internal landscape during moments of temptation, we can identify the precise thoughts and physical sensations that precede a loss of resolve. The willpower instinct. Pause and plan. To counter these internal threats, the body possesses a second, equally powerful biological mechanism, often referred to as the pause and plan response. While the fight-or-flight response is ignited by external danger, this self-mastery instinct is triggered by the recognition of internal conflict. It occurs when a primal desire clashes with a deeper long-term value. Because the danger arises from the potential of making a poor decision, the body's most effective defense is to slow down, not speed up. The pause and plan response shifts the physiological state away from frantic, impulsive action, creating a space for deliberate reflection and intentional choice. This is your brain and body on willpower.
This instinct of restraint begins with an intricate self-monitoring system distributed throughout the brain, constantly scanning for internal warning signs, urges or emotions that signal an impending lapse in judgment. When an internal conflict is detected, the prefrontal cortex is fully activated, mobilizing to steer behavior toward the harder, more beneficial path. To support this intense cognitive effort, the pause and plan response actively redirects energy away from the muscles and toward the brain. The body's entire tempo changes. Heart rate decelerates, blood pressure stabilizes, and breathing deepens. Instead of tensing for a physical struggle, the body relaxes just enough to prevent automatic, reflexive reactions, granting the individual the crucial temporal buffer needed to walk away from temptation with their long-term goals intact. The body's willpower. Reserve. The most accurate biological metric of this capacity for self-restraint is heart rate variability. A healthy heart does not beat with mechanical rigidity. Its rhythm naturally fluctuates, accelerating slightly during inhalation and decelerating during exhalation. This subtle variation is a sign of a balanced nervous system, reflecting the harmonious interplay between the systems that drive arousal and those that promote calm. Under acute stress, the arousal system dominates, heart rate elevates, and variability plummets, locking the body into a rigid state of fight or flight. Conversely, when an individual successfully exercises restraint, the calming branch of the nervous system engages, heart rate decreases, and variability rises. This elevated heart rate variability is the physical manifestation of focus and calm, serving as a physiological reserve of strength. Individuals with high heart rate variability demonstrate vastly superior abilities to manage stress, ignore distractions, and delay gratification. However, this reserve is deeply sensitive to overall well-being. Chronic stress, poor nutrition, lack of sleep, and emotional distress all deplete heart rate variability, leaving the individual biologically disadvantaged and highly susceptible to impulse. Willpower experiment. Breathe your way to self-control. A profoundly effective method to instantly elevate one's physiological capacity for restraint is to deliberately slow the rhythm of respiration by consciously extending each breath to last 10 to 15 seconds, equating to roughly 4 to 6 breaths per minute. The body is manually shifted out of a state of stress and into the pause and plan mode. This simple, rhythmic breathing activates the prefrontal cortex and increases heart rate variability, immediately expanding the body's reserve of resolve. With regular practice, this intentional deceleration of breath not only provides acute relief in moments of temptation, but fundamentally increases long-term resilience against stress. Willpower RX. Consider the practical application of this technique in a high-stakes professional environment. Medical professionals facing the intense pressures of emergency care and complex patient interactions often find their cognitive abilities compromised by stress. By employing slowed breathing techniques prior to difficult conversations or during exhausting shifts, they are able to biologically anchor themselves. This physiological intervention clears the mind, allowing for precise decision-making under pressure and transforming an overwhelming sense of helplessness into a calm, commanding presence. Train your mind and your body. The pursuit of heightened self-mastery is inextricably linked to physical health. Strategies that genuinely enhance our capacity to resist temptation are often those that simultaneously improve our overall biological resilience. By investing in practices that fortify the body against chronic disease and psychological fatigue, we can currently build the physiological infrastructure necessary to sustain our deepest aspirations. The willpower miracle. If one were to engineer a pharmaceutical intervention that simultaneously sharpened focus, reduced cravings for destructive substances, improved dietary choices, mitigated procrastination, and elevated financial responsibility, it would be hailed as a medical miracle. Yet, this exact profound transformation is consistently observed not from a pill, but from the simple integration of regular physical activity. Exercise stands as the single most potent catalyst for comprehensive behavioral change. Even moderate, infrequent engagement in physical activity initiates a cascade of self-regulatory benefits across entirely unrelated domains of life. The physiological impact is both immediate and enduring, A brief bout of exertion rapidly suppresses acute cravings, while long-term adherence fundamentally remodels the brain, increasing the density of the prefrontal cortex and enhancing neural efficiency. Physical exercise operates as a premier biological engine for generating restraint. Willpower experiment. The 5-minute green willpower fill-up. The profound benefits of physical exertion do not demand grueling hours of high-intensity suffering. Brief, mindful immersions in natural environments, even a mere 5 minutes of walking outdoors, yield immediate neurological dividends. This minimal dose of green exercise is sufficient to significantly lower stress hormones, elevate mood, and replenish depleted cognitive reserves. Lower-intensity outdoor activities often produce a more rapid and potent restorative effect than punishing gym sessions, proving that consistency and environment are critical components of maintaining resolve. A reluctant exerciser changes his mind. Many individuals initially resist physical activity, viewing it as a burdensome chore that detracts from already limited time and energy. This perspective treats exercise as a depletion rather than a source of strength. However, when the paradigm shifts, when physical activity is recognized as the very mechanism that generates the cognitive stamina required for daily success, resistance often dissolves. By reframing exercise as a deliberate strategy to accumulate the energy necessary to excel in high-pressure scenarios, what was once an agonizing obligation transforms into an indispensable, empowering ritual. Gain willpower in your sleep. Operating under chronic sleep deprivation fundamentally cripples the biological architecture of self-mastery. Inadequate rest impairs the brain's ability to efficiently utilize glucose, the primary fuel for cognitive function. When the prefrontal cortex is starved of its necessary energy, it enters a state of mild dysfunction, mirroring the effects of actual neurological damage or intoxication. This energetic deficit severs the connection between the brain's rational command center and its primitive alarm system. Consequently, the brain overreacts to minor stressors, locking the body into a perpetual state of fight or flight, plummeting heart rate variability, and leaving the individual entirely vulnerable to immediate gratification and impulsive behavior. Willpower experiment. Reversing the profound deficits of exhaustion is critical for restoring the capacity to choose wisely. This does not always necessitate a flawless 8-hour slumber every night. Strategic interventions, such as prioritizing a single night of comprehensive rest to reset optimal brain function, briefly napping to acutely restore focus, or banking sleep prior to anticipated periods of deprivation, can significantly mitigate the devastating impact of exhaustion on our decision-making capabilities. When sleep is the willpower challenge, often the act of going to sleep itself becomes a profound test of resolve. When individuals find themselves endlessly deferring rest in favor of trivial distractions, mindless scrolling, late-night television, or fabricated chores, it reveals a fundamental struggle with impulse control. Late at night, as cognitive fatigue peaks, the allure of immediate, effortless gratification vastly overpowers the sensible goal of rest. To conquer this, one must recognize that the challenge is not forcing sleep, but actively ceasing the behaviors that prevent it. By establishing rigid boundaries against evening stimulation, individuals can break the cycle of self-sabotage, allowing their natural fatigue to guide them toward the recovery they desperately need. The costs of too much self-control. While the biological capacity for restraint is magnificent, it is exceptionally costly to maintain. Constantly overriding impulses, managing focus, and suppressing emotional reactions demands immense reserves of physical energy. Just as the body cannot endure an unrelenting fight-or-flight stress response without suffering devastating health consequences, it cannot sustain an unbroken state of cognitive vigilance. Chronic, uninterrupted self-control drains vitality, diverts crucial resources away from the immune system, and can ultimately lead to profound physiological and psychological exhaustion. The pursuit of perfect discipline is not merely a fool's errand, it is biologically toxic. To endure, we must recognize our limits and strategically choose where to deploy our precious reserves of resolve. Chapter 3. Too tired to resist. Why self-control is like a muscle. There is a profound and universal phenomenon experienced by anyone who has ever attempted to change their life: the gradual, inevitable erosion of resolve as the day progresses. We often awaken with absolute clarity, our intentions firmly set, fully prepared to tackle difficult projects, consume nourishing foods, and respond to provocations with infinite patience. Yet, as the hours unfold and the friction of daily life exacts its toll, this pristine morning discipline steadily unravels. By nightfall, the once unbreakable determination to exercise transforms into a desperate desire for the couch, and the solemn vow to avoid sugar dissolves at the mere sight of a dessert. This predictable decline is not a manifestation of weak character or a sudden loss of sincerity. It is the reflection of a fundamental biological truth. Modern research has illuminated a critical reality about human self-regulation. Our capacity for restraint, focus, and emotional management is not a limitless well. Instead, it operates remarkably like a physical muscle. Just as a runner's legs inevitably fatigue after miles of exertion, our willpower becomes exhausted through continuous use. Every act of self-discipline, whether it involves suppressing anger during a frustrating commute, forcing oneself to decipher a complex spreadsheet, or resisting the urge to check a digital notification, draws from the exact same singular reservoir of strength. We do not possess separate reserves for dieting, working, and emotional regulation. Consequently, exerting massive effort to be productive at the office directly depletes the energy required to maintain patience at home or make healthy choices at dinner. Understanding this muscle model of self-control drastically alters how we must approach personal transformation. It demands that we treat our resolve with the same strategic care that an athlete affords their physical stamina. To master this fluctuating resource, one must become a meticulous observer of their own internal energy cycles. This requires a forensic examination of the daily rhythms of one's own willpower. Throughout the day, the strength of our resolve ebbs and flows in a predictable pattern, unique to each individual's circumstances and biological clock. The crucial task is to identify the precise moments when focus is razor-sharp and the specific hours when the mind feels brittle, fragile, and uniquely vulnerable to temptation. By actively mapping these peaks and valleys of cognitive stamina, one ceases to be a victim of sudden, mysterious collapses in discipline. Instead, a profound self-awareness develops, allowing an individual to anticipate the inevitable evening exhaustion rather than being blindsided by it. Consider the plight of an aspiring business founder who struggled for months to launch a secondary enterprise while maintaining a demanding full-time job. His strategy was to dedicate his evenings to the arduous work of building his business plan. However, night after night, he found himself utterly incapable of initiating the necessary tasks, seduced instead by television and trivial distractions. His failure was not a lack of passion for his new venture, but a critical misunderstanding of his own cognitive depletion. After spending 8 hours utilizing his self-control muscle to navigate office politics and execute professional duties, his reservoir was entirely empty by 6 o'clock. His breakthrough occurred only when he ceased fighting his biology and fundamentally restructured his approach. By shifting his most challenging willpower-dependent work, the entrepreneurial tasks, to the early morning, before the day's relentless demands could drain his reserves, he finally began to make progress. He learned that when the muscle is exhausted, profound aspirations must yield to biological reality, making strategic scheduling the ultimate safeguard of our deepest ambitions. This exhaustion is not merely a psychological metaphor, it is deeply rooted in the physical reality of the brain's energy consumption. The prefrontal cortex, the neural center of self-control, is an astonishingly demanding organ. When we force ourselves to perform an arduous task or suppress a deeply ingrained impulse, the brain consumes a massive amount of metabolic energy, pulling resources from the bloodstream at an accelerated rate. This intense activity creates a literal energy crisis within the body. As the brain detects this rapid depletion of fuel, it initiates a defensive, conservative posture. It begins to restrict energy flow to the very regions responsible for complex long-term thinking, shutting down the resource-heavy prefrontal cortex in an effort to hoard remaining energy. The biological consequence is a sudden, dramatic drop in self-discipline. The body's response to this energetic drain is profoundly primitive. In our evolutionary past, a sudden drop in available energy was not a signal of working too hard on a spreadsheet. It was a terrifying alarm indicating potential starvation. When modern blood sugar levels dip due to intense cognitive effort, the ancient survival mechanisms of the brain are activated. To a starving brain, long-term goals like weight loss or financial prudence become completely irrelevant. The immediate, desperate mandate is to acquire calories and seek instant gratification. Consequently, a brain experiencing an energy deficit becomes highly impulsive, deeply risk-prone, and fiercely oriented toward immediate reward. It is biologically impossible to ask a physiologically starving system to prioritize abstract future benefits over the immediate visceral promise of a sugary snack or a fleeting pleasure. To fortify the biological foundation of resolve, one must prioritize metabolic stability over fleeting bursts of artificial energy. Many individuals attempt to counteract their daily exhaustion with massive infusions of sugar and caffeine, which create violent spikes in blood sugar followed by devastating crashes, ultimately leaving the self-control muscle weaker than before. True resilience requires adopting a nutritional strategy designed to provide a slow, steady, and sustained release of fuel to the brain. By shifting toward low glycemic foods, complex carbohydrates, lean proteins, and healthy fats, the brain is guaranteed a constant, reliable source of energy. This deliberate nutritional approach prevents the biological panic that triggers impulsive behavior, ensuring that the prefrontal cortex remains adequately fueled and fully operational throughout the rigors of the day. While the muscle model of self-control explains our exhaustion, it also offers a profound message of hope. Muscles can be strengthened. Just as physical exercise tears down muscle fibers so they can rebuild with greater density and power, deliberately challenging our self-control can expand our overall capacity for restraint. The brain is remarkably adaptable, and engaging in regular, systematic acts of discipline forces the neural pathways associated with willpower to become more efficient and robust. This training does not require monumental acts of deprivation. In fact, attempting to overhaul one's entire life simultaneously usually results in catastrophic failure due to immediate exhaustion. Instead, the most effective training involves small, consistent, and highly specific challenges that force the brain to pause and override an automatic habit. A remarkably effective method for building this cognitive stamina involves instituting minor, deliberate inconveniences into daily life. For instance, committing to using one's non-dominant hand for mundane tasks like opening doors or brushing teeth forces a continuous, low-level interruption of automatic behavior. Similarly, dedicating a week to strictly monitoring and correcting one's posture or consciously eliminating a specific verbal crutch from one's vocabulary serves as a relentless, subtle workout for the self-control muscle. Because these tasks are relatively trivial, they do not trigger profound emotional resistance, yet they consistently demand that the prefrontal cortex awaken and take charge of automatic impulses. Over time, these small acts of daily friction drastically enlarge the overall reservoir of discipline, creating a surplus of willpower that can be deployed against much larger, more significant temptations. This incremental training was masterfully demonstrated by an individual battling a severe, lifelong compulsion to consume unhealthy amounts of sugar. Rather than attempting a drastic, painful purge of all sweets, a strategy that had repeatedly ended in agonizing failure, he approached the challenge as a slow conditioning of his self-control muscle. He began by simply carrying a piece of candy with him at all times, making it completely accessible but committing to not consuming it in that exact moment. By constantly sitting with the proximity of temptation and repeatedly exercising the quiet restraint required to delay consumption, he built an extraordinary tolerance for the presence of his trigger. The candy ceased to be an overwhelming psychological threat and became merely an object. Through small, sustained exposures to discomfort, he essentially rewired his brain's response, proving that profound freedom from addiction often begins with mastering the smallest possible unit of resistance. However, as we push against the boundaries of our discipline, we must ask a critical question. When we feel utterly depleted, is our reservoir truly empty, or is the brain playing a trick on us? Sports science provides a fascinating parallel. When a long-distance runner hits the infamous wall and feels entirely incapable of taking another step, their muscles have not actually failed. Instead, the brain, acting as an overly cautious governor, induces the sensation of agonizing fatigue to force the runner to stop long before permanent physiological damage occurs. The exhaustion is real to the mind, but it is a protective illusion. Similarly, when we feel completely drained of willpower, convinced we cannot study for another minute or resist a craving for another second, we are rarely at the absolute limit of our biological capacity. The brain is simply throwing up a warning signal, attempting to conserve energy for unknown future emergencies. Understanding this psychological governor allows us to carefully push past the initial wave of mental fatigue. When the overwhelming sensation of exhaustion strikes, the immediate instinct is to surrender. Yet, if one can simply observe that feeling, recognizing it as a conservative biological alarm rather than an absolute mandate, it is often possible to access a deeper, secondary reservoir of strength. By challenging the brain's premature declaration of defeat, we discover that our limits are much further out than our initial discomfort suggests. The true art of self-mastery involves learning to decipher the difference between genuine, dangerous depletion and the mind's routine attempt to avoid necessary discomfort. The key to bypassing this biological governor and unlocking hidden reserves of stamina lies in the profound influence of deep, authentic desire. The brain is highly sensitive to the perceived value of a task. When we are performing an action merely out of obligation or external pressure, the brain quickly restricts energy, leading to rapid exhaustion. However, when an endeavor is intimately connected to our most deeply held values, passions, or the survival of those we love, the brain recognizes the high stakes and eagerly opens the floodgates of energy. When a profound want is activated, the perception of limits shatters. This is why a parent can endure sleepless nights and agonizing stress to care for a sick child, accessing a level of endurance that would be impossible to summon for a routine office project. The motivation fundamentally alters the brain's willingness to expend fuel. To consistently tap into this deeper well of strength, one must clearly identify and articulate their ultimate want power. This requires peeling back the superficial layers of any goal to uncover the raw emotional core driving the effort. If the goal is financial stability, the true motivation might be the desperate desire to provide security for a family. If the goal is physical health, the core drive might be the yearning to be vibrant and active for future grandchildren. By clearly defining this profound, non-negotiable value and violently dragging it to the forefront of the mind when the illusion of exhaustion sets in, the emotional weight of the true desire can override the brain's conservative alarms. This profound emotional override was the salvation of a deeply stressed mother who found herself constantly losing her temper with her young children after exhausting days at work. She realized that trying to simply suppress her frustration through sheer force of will was a failing strategy. Her self-control muscle was genuinely fatigued by evening. However, she identified her ultimate want, her desperate desire to raise children who felt safe, loved, and emotionally secure. When she felt the familiar, exhausted urge to scream, she didn't just try to hold it back. She actively summoned the image of the mother she profoundly wanted to be. By connecting the momentary struggle to her highest, most sacred value, she bypassed her daily depletion, finding the necessary grace and patience in a reservoir she previously believed was empty. When this profound understanding of personal energy and core motivation is lost on a massive scale, the consequences extend far beyond individual failure. We live in an era characterized by chronic stress, sleep deprivation, and relentless demands on our attention, a society that is perpetually, biologically depleted. When millions of individuals are operating with exhausted prefrontal cortices, the collective capacity to resist impulsive, short-sighted behavior collapses. This societal depletion fuels epidemics of debt, addiction, and aggressive conflict as tired minds inevitably default to the easiest, most instantly gratifying choices. The struggle for self-mastery, therefore, is not merely a private, aesthetic pursuit of a better life. It is a fundamental requirement for the stability and flourishment of civilization itself. Ultimately, we must navigate a delicate paradox. We are bound by a physical biology that dictates our limits, requiring us to respect our energy, nourish our brains, and tactically schedule our most difficult endeavors. Yet we must also fiercely resist the mind's tendency to underestimate its own power. By systematically training our capacity for discomfort and intimately anchoring our daily actions to our deepest, most profound desires, we can stretch the boundaries of what is biologically possible, transforming the fragile muscle of our willpower into an enduring engine of profound personal triumph. Chapter 4. License to Sin. Why being good gives us permission to be bad. It is a peculiar quirk of human nature that our greatest moments of self-discipline frequently become the very catalysts for our most spectacular failures. We often operate under the illusion that progress in our personal development is a linear ascent, a steady march toward an idealized version of ourselves. Yet, a closer examination of our behavior reveals a far more convoluted path, where an act of virtue is often swiftly followed by a deliberate indulgence. This phenomenon, where demonstrating our goodness paradoxically frees us to be bad, represents one of the most insidious traps in the quest for self-mastery. The psychological mechanics underlying this sabotage do not stem from a sudden loss of resolve, but rather from a profound, often unconscious, shift in how we justify our actions to ourselves. The root of this paradox lies in a transition from aspiring saints to willing sinners. When we make a choice that aligns with our higher goals, whether it involves declining a decadent dessert, completing a grueling workout, or holding our tongue during a heated argument, we experience a surge of moral satisfaction. We feel righteous. However, this feeling of righteousness is dangerously intoxicating. The moment we crown ourselves with a halo for our good behavior, an internal accounting system is activated. We suddenly feel that we have earned a reward for our sacrifice. This is the essence of moral licensing, the belief that a good deed grants us the right to misbehave. The psychological trap is that we stop viewing our long-term goal as the ultimate prize and start viewing our temporary restraint as a currency we can spend on immediate gratification. The warm and fuzzy logic of licensing operates like a moral checkbook. When we deposit a virtuous act, we feel perfectly justified in withdrawing an indulgence. The danger is that this internal mathematics is notoriously flawed. We vastly overestimate the value of our good deeds and completely minimize the cost of our transgressions. We might spend an hour at the gym, burning a modest number of calories, and then reward ourselves with a meal that contains 3 times the energy we just expended, genuinely believing we have broken even. This internal negotiation happens effortlessly because it feels so perfectly fair to our exhausted minds. We convince ourselves that because we have been good, we deserve to be bad, transforming destructive behaviors into well-earned treats. To dismantle this destructive cycle, one must put their own concepts of virtue and vice under the microscope. The very act of categorizing our choices as good or bad is the foundation of moral licensing. When we view a salad as a morally superior choice and a burger as a sin, eating the salad becomes a virtuous act that must be compensated. The key to escaping this trap is to strip away the moral weight from our daily actions. Choosing to exercise or save money does not make a person inherently better, and skipping a workout or overspending does not make them wicked. These are simply actions moving us closer to or further from our personal objectives. By detaching our self-worth from these choices, we remove the psychological mechanism that demands a reward for every step forward. Consider the frustrating predicament of a bride-to-be who diligently initiated a rigorous exercise regimen in prep, yet found herself inexplicably gaining weight. Her commitment to physical activity was unquestionable, but the psychological aftermath of each workout proved disastrous. Every time she left the gym, she felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment, a deep certainty that she had been incredibly good. This powerful feeling of virtue immediately licensed her to indulge in larger portions and sweeter treats throughout the rest of the day. She wasn't consciously trying to sabotage her goal. Her brain simply used her undeniable progress as an undeniable justification for reward. The exercise, rather than moving her toward her desired outcome, became the very excuse that actively pushed her away from it. This highlights the profound problem with progress. It is widely accepted that acknowledging our advancement toward a goal is essential for maintaining motivation. However, focusing heavily on how far we have come can frequently backfire. When we look at our past successes, our brain often interprets this as a signal that we have done enough. The urgency of the goal diminishes, replaced by a comfortable sense of security. This relaxation of tension is the perfect breeding ground for indulgence. The progress itself becomes the license to slack off, turning our past victories into the architects of our future defeats. To effectively revoke this internal license, a crucial shift in perspective is required. Instead of focusing on the progress made, we must actively remember the why. When we successfully resist a temptation or complete a difficult task, the vital question to ask is not, "How well have I done?" but rather, "Why did I choose to do this?" By reconnecting with the fundamental reason for our effort, whether it is long-term health, financial freedom, or personal integrity, we bypass the internal accounting system that seeks a reward. Remembering the core motivation reinforces our commitment to the ultimate goal, transforming a momentary success from a reason to stop into a reason to continue. The deceptive nature of licensing extends far beyond our past actions. It frequently reaches into our future. We possess a remarkable, albeit disastrous, ability to use tomorrow's planned virtue to excuse today's indulgence. We tell ourselves that we will undoubtedly start the diet on Monday, which miraculously makes the weekend's excess feel entirely acceptable. This psychological maneuver, when tomorrow licenses today, is particularly devastating because the future virtue is entirely imaginary, yet the present indulgence is entirely real. We borrow credit from a future self who we assume will possess infinite discipline, ignoring the reality that tomorrow's choices will be just as difficult as today's. This forward-looking licensing is perfectly illustrated by a fascinating study examining restaurant menus. Researchers discovered that when a notoriously unhealthy fast food establishment added a prominently featured, highly nutritious salad to its menu, sales of their most calorie-dense items actually increased. The mere act of considering the healthy option provided customers with a subtle surge of moral credit. They felt good, simply knowing they had the opportunity to make a virtuous choice. Having mentally patted themselves on the back for even noticing the salad, they felt completely justified in ordering the double bacon cheeseburger. They learned the hard way: do not count your grilled chicken salad before it is hatched. The intention to be good is frequently mistaken for the act of being good. It is vital to examine whether you are secretly borrowing credit from tomorrow. We must investigate the quiet promises we make to ourselves to balance the scales of our behavior. Are we justifying a skipped workout with a vow to run twice as far the next day? Are we explaining away an impulsive purchase with a firm commitment to save rigorously next month? These phantom commitments act as an invisible safety net, allowing us to fall without fear. By exposing these silent bargains, we can recognize them for what they truly are: sophisticated rationalizations designed to protect our immediate desires from our long-term aspirations. Our reliance on these future promises is rooted in a fundamental psychological bias. We genuinely believe that there will always be more time, more energy, and more willpower tomorrow. We look at our present state, tired, stressed, and overwhelmed, and assume this is an anomaly. We envision a future self who is rested, focused, and entirely capable of making the difficult choices we are currently avoiding. This profound disconnect between our present reality and our future fantasy guarantees that we will continue to defer the heavy lifting of self-improvement, perpetually chasing a perfect tomorrow that never arrives. To counteract this destructive optimism, a powerful experiment involves treating tomorrow precisely like today. Instead of viewing our choices as isolated incidents, we must recognize that our behavior is establishing a persistent pattern. When facing a temptation, the challenge is to eliminate behavioral variability. Do not ask if you can indulge just this once and be perfect tomorrow. Instead, ask yourself if you are willing to make this exact same indulgent choice every single day for the rest of your life. By forcing the mind to confront the cumulative consequences of a repeated action, the illusion of the isolated treat is shattered. It strips away the comforting lie of future perfection and anchors us firmly to the gravity of our present choice. Sometimes, the desire to balance our moral ledger takes subtler forms, such as being a vegetarian before dinner. This concept describes the strategy of making numerous small, relatively painless, virtuous choices throughout the day to justify a massive indulgence later. An individual might meticulously count calories at breakfast and lunch, proudly demonstrating their restraint, only to completely abandon all discipline when the evening meal arrives. The earlier restraint was never truly about achieving the goal. It was a deliberate stockpiling of moral currency specifically intended to be squandered. The facade of discipline is maintained just long enough to secure the psychological permission to ultimately fail. The deception of licensing becomes even more treacherous when sin masterfully disguises itself as virtue. Our brains are incredibly susceptible to superficial cues, frequently ignoring the reality of our choices in favor of their packaging. This is known as the halo effect. When a product, action, or decision possesses a single, highly visible positive attribute, our minds automatically extend a glowing halo over the entire entity, blinding us to its less desirable qualities. We see a label proclaiming 0 trans fats on a box of cookies, and the halo effect convinces us that the entire package is somehow beneficial to our health, entirely obscuring the massive quantities of sugar and refined carbohydrates it contains. Marketers are exceptionally skilled at deploying magic words to trigger this halo effect. Terms such as organic, fair trade, natural, or diet act as psychological shortcuts, bypassing our critical thinking and instantly communicating virtue. When we encounter these words, our internal alarm systems deactivate. We assume that because a product is environmentally friendly or ethically sourced, it must also be calorically benign or financially responsible. The presence of a single magic word provides the necessary moral licensing to consume more, spend more, and ultimately undermine the very goals we believe we are supporting. It is imperative to put your own susceptibilities under the microscope and ask, are you handing out halos? We must identify the specific words, brands, or concepts that instantly disarm our critical faculties. Does buying an item at a massive discount make the spending feel virtuous? Does choosing a salad as a side dish magically neutralize the caloric impact of the main course? By actively recognizing the specific triggers that automatically grant our choices unearned virtue, we can begin to dismantle the illusions that lead us astray. The financial consequences of the halo effect are particularly insidious. Consider a shopper seduced by savings who enters a store with a strict budget. They discover an expensive item significantly marked down and purchase it, feeling an immense sense of triumph and financial prudence. The discount acts as a glowing halo, convincing them they have saved a substantial amount of money. Intoxicated by this perceived virtue, they proceed to purchase several other items they never intended to buy, utilizing the imaginary savings to justify the real expense. The act of saving money became the very mechanism that licensed them to spend entirely beyond their means. This paradox extends even to our highest moral aspirations, revealing the hidden risks of going green. Studies have shown that consumers who actively choose environmentally friendly products, demonstrating a clear preference for ethical consumption, often subsequently display an increased propensity for dishonesty or selfishness in unrelated tasks. The act of supporting a noble cause fills their moral bank account to the brim, providing a robust psychological license to act less ethically in other domains. The righteous glow of the green purchase inadvertently funds a deficit in personal integrity, demonstrating how dangerous untethered moral satisfaction can truly be. Ultimately, mastering this complex psychological terrain requires a profound re-evaluation of our fundamental identity. We must put our very sense of self under the microscope and ask, who do you think you are? As long as we view ourselves through the binary lens of saint and sinner, believing we are inherently flawed individuals who must occasionally force ourselves to be good, moral licensing will always defeat us. We will forever treat our positive actions as unnatural sacrifices demanding compensation. The true transformation occurs when we stop identifying with the struggle and start identifying with the goal. The last word on this matter is that true self-mastery is not a system of rewards and punishments, nor is it a careful balancing of moral ledgers. It is the steady, unglamorous process of aligning our daily actions with our deepest values. When making the right choice is no longer viewed as a heroic act of willpower deserving of a prize, but simply as an expression of who we truly are and what we genuinely want, the destructive cycle of licensing is finally broken. In closing, this exploration reveals that feeling good about our past behavior is often the greatest threat to our future goals. By mistaking moral satisfaction for actual progress, we grant ourselves permission to indulge. We borrow discipline from tomorrow to excuse the excess of today, and we allow superficial halos to blind us to the true cost of our choices. To achieve lasting change, we must abandon the accounting system of virtue and vice, anchor ourselves fiercely to the why behind our efforts, and recognize that true progress does not demand a reward. It is the reward. Chapter 5. The Brain's Big Lie: Why We Mistake Wanting for Happiness. In the mid-20th century, two scientists stumbled upon a profound neurological secret while attempting to study the fear response in a laboratory rat. Due to a misplaced electrode, they accidentally stimulated an uncharted area of the rat's brain. Instead of avoiding the stimulus, the rat became fiercely obsessed with it. The animal would endure physical pain, forego food to the point of starvation, and willingly cross an electrified grid just to experience another jolt. The scientists initially concluded they had discovered the brain's pleasure center, believing the rat was experiencing pure, unadulterated bliss. This assumption, however, was fundamentally flawed. The rat was not experiencing joy, it was experiencing an overwhelming, insatiable desire. The scientists had actually discovered the brain's reward system, a primitive motivational engine designed not to create contentment, but to compel action. This system doesn't deliver happiness. It promises it. Every jolt to that region of the brain essentially whispered, "Do this again, and you will feel wonderful." The tragedy, both for the rat and for human beings, is that the promised satisfaction never actually arrives. Understanding how this system operates is crucial for mastering self-control, as it explains why we repeatedly succumb to temptations that ultimately leave us feeling empty, anxious, or deeply regretful. The neurobiology of I want. The mechanics of this internal promise are driven by a powerful neurotransmitter called dopamine. When the brain detects an opportunity for a potential reward, whether it is the scent of fresh pastries, a notification on a smartphone, or a sale sign in a storefront, it releases a flood of dopamine. This chemical surge acts as a biological siren, commanding the brain's attention and focusing all energy on acquiring the perceived prize. It is critical to recognize that a dopamine rush does not equate to the feeling of happiness or fulfillment. Rather, it creates a state of intense arousal and anticipation. We feel captivated, alert, and driven by the deep conviction that acquiring the object of our desire will bring us joy. Modern neuroscience has demonstrated that dopamine is responsible for the pursuit of reward, not the enjoyment of it. Without dopamine, desire vanishes. Yet, even when dopamine compels us to tirelessly chase a goal, the actual attainment of that goal often registers in entirely different areas of the brain, frequently with far less intensity than the craving itself. Evolution engineered this system to ensure our survival, using the mirage of ultimate satisfaction to keep us hunting, gathering, and reproducing. In our modern environment, however, this primitive survival mechanism is constantly hijacked by endless, easily accessible stimuli, from calorie-dense foods to digital entertainment, leaving us perpetually chasing a promise that is never kept. Under the microscope, what gets your dopamine neurons firing? To reclaim agency over your choices, you must first identify the specific stimuli that activate your reward system. Consider what uniquely captures your attention and sets your pulse racing. Is it the prospect of a sugary treat, the allure of online shopping, the ping of a social media update, or perhaps the promise of a sudden financial windfall? This week, actively observe your internal reactions. Notice the precise moments when a casual interest transforms into an urgent, undeniable craving. What are the specific triggers in your daily environment that unleash this powerful biological promise of reward, leaving you singularly focused on seeking satisfaction? Under the microscope, neuromarketing and environmental triggers. Our vulnerability to the promise of reward has not gone unnoticed by those who seek to profit from our impulses. The modern retail and digital landscapes are meticulously engineered to keep our dopamine neurons firing constantly. Neuromarketing strategies deliberately utilize environmental cues, such as the strategic placement of free samples, the unpredictable algorithms of video games, or the aggressive promotion of limited-time discounts, to manufacture desire and override our rational decision-making. When we are bathed in dopamine, we become highly susceptible to immediate gratification and blind to long-term consequences. Take a critical look at your surroundings. Observe how grocery stores, websites, and advertisements are designed to trigger your reward system. Recognize that these environments are purposefully structured to keep you in a perpetual state of wanting, tricking your brain into believing that consumption is the only path to satisfaction. Willpower experiment. Dopaminize your I will power challenge. While the dopamine system frequently leads us astray, it is not inherently evil. It is merely an engine of motivation. Since we cannot eradicate our biological drive for reward, we can strategically harness it to support our long-term objectives. Consider the tasks you consistently procrastinate on or actively avoid. How can you artificially inject a sense of anticipation into these dreaded chores? By pairing an unpleasant I will challenge with a reliable dopamine trigger, you can trick your brain into wanting to engage. This might involve completing a tedious report while sitting in your favorite coffee shop, tackling household chores while listening to highly engaging music, or visually meditating on the profound ultimate payoff of your hard work before you begin. By consciously linking your necessary tasks to stimuli that activate your reward system, you can transform resistance into eager anticipation. Under the microscope, the stress of desire. We are heavily conditioned to focus on the anticipated pleasure of a craving, yet we rarely acknowledge the profound discomfort that accompanies it. Dopamine employs a dual strategy to motivate us. It offers the carrot of promised happiness, but it also wields the stick of anxiety. When the reward system is activated, it simultaneously triggers the brain's stress centers. This creates a deeply conflicting internal state where desire is experienced alongside tension, impatience, and a frantic sense of urgency. We often misinterpret this distress, believing that the object of our craving will cure the very anxiety it has caused. The next time you find yourself gripped by temptation, turn your attention inward to the physical and emotional sensations of wanting. Do you feel relaxed and joyful, or do you feel tense, agitated, and desperate? Notice how the promise of reward inherently generates stress, and recognize that yielding to the temptation is often merely an attempt to escape the uncomfortable pressure created by your own brain. Willpower experiment. Test the promise of reward. To break the spell of an irresistible craving, you must force your brain to confront the reality of the experience rather than its idealized expectation. Select a specific temptation that you frequently indulge in under the false belief that it brings you happiness. Rather than mindlessly consuming it, intentionally and mindfully indulge. Pay acute attention to the initial surge of anticipation. Then, as you give in, critically evaluate the actual experience. Does the physical reality of the indulgence match the profound joy your brain promised? Notice when, if ever, a genuine sense of satisfaction arrives. Does the craving dissipate, or does the consumption merely fuel an endless desire for more? By rigorously testing the promise of reward against the reality of the experience, you will likely discover a massive discrepancy. Recognizing that the reward rarely delivers the promised salvation is a vital step towards stripping the temptation of its power. The paradox of reward. We find ourselves caught in a profound neurological paradox. The promise of reward is inherently flawed. It frequently drives us toward behaviors that undermine our well-being and rarely delivers the lasting happiness it advertises. However, a brain entirely devoid of this promise is not a brain at peace. It is a brain suffering from profound apathy and depression. Without the dopamine-driven anticipation of pleasure, we lose all motivation to engage with life, pursue goals, or even get out of bed. We require the promise of reward to sustain our vitality and drive. The objective, therefore, is not to eliminate desire, but to elevate our understanding of it. We must learn to distinguish between the superficial, manufactured cravings that leave us empty and the authentic pursuits that genuinely enrich our lives. The last word. Ultimately, desire is the brain's fundamental strategy for ensuring action. It is a neutral biological mechanism that can serve as either our greatest adversary or our most powerful ally. When our dopamine neurons steer us toward destructive temptations, our defense lies in recognizing the brain's deception, understanding that the desperate urge we feel is a biological imperative, not a guarantee of joy. Yet, we must also embrace our capacity to intentionally recruit this same system, aiming our profound sense of wanting toward our highest aspirations. True self-mastery is found not in the eradication of desire, but in the wisdom to know which promises of happiness are true and the strength to walk away from the ones that are false. Chapter summary. The idea. Our brains mistake the promise of reward for a guarantee of happiness, causing us to relentlessly pursue satisfaction from sources that fundamentally cannot deliver it. Under the microscope. What gets your dopamine neurons firing? Identify the specific triggers that unleash the promise of reward and compel you to seek immediate gratification. Neuromarketing and environmental triggers. Observe how retailers and marketers intentionally manipulate your environment to activate your reward system. The stress of desire. Pay close attention to the anxiety and tension that inherently accompany the experience of wanting. Willpower experiments. Dopaminize your I Willpower challenge. Overcome procrastination by deliberately linking an unpleasant task with a stimulus that activates your dopamine neurons. Test the promise of reward. Mindfully indulge in a persistent temptation and rigorously compare the actual experience of consumption with the brain's exaggerated promise of happiness. Chapter 6. What the hell? How feeling bad leads to giving in. There is a pervasive and deeply ingrained cultural belief that guilt, shame, and self-criticism are the ultimate engines of behavioral change. We operate under the assumption that if we just make ourselves feel terrible enough about our failures, we will magically summon the discipline to succeed. Yet, psychological realities paint an entirely different picture. The truth is that feeling bad is the absolute most effective way to ensure a total collapse of resolve. When we experience emotional distress, whether from a stressful day at work or the guilt of a broken diet, our brains do not instinctively seek discipline. They desperately seek comfort. This biological drive for relief initiates a cascade of self-sabotage that frequently culminates in what researchers call the what the hell effect. Understanding how negative emotions weaponize our cravings against us is essential for escaping the vicious cycle of self-punishment and surrender. To comprehend why stress makes us want, we must look at the brain's emergency response to emotional pain. When we are upset, anxious, or overwhelmed, the brain senses a threat to our well-being. Its immediate priority is not to uphold our long-term goals of sobriety, health, or financial prudence, but to rescue us from the acute discomfort of the present moment. To achieve this, it activates the reward system, flooding our neural pathways with dopamine. The brain remembers that certain behaviors, eating sugar, drinking alcohol, spending money, have previously provided temporary emotional numbness or a fleeting spike of pleasure. Therefore, stress fundamentally rewires the brain to become hyper-receptive to temptation. The craving is not a sign of weak character, it is the brain's misguided attempt to protect us from despair. By putting this dynamic under the microscope, we can observe the promise of relief in our own lives. We must pay close attention to the specific coping mechanisms we turn to when our mood plummets. When you feel exhausted, rejected, or anxious, what does your brain instinctively demand? Does it promise that a heavy meal, a glass of wine, or an hour of mindless internet scrolling will suddenly make the world feel safe and manageable? Recognizing that these cravings are essentially stress responses disguised as desires is the first step toward dismantling their power. We must also put under the microscope what's terrifying you. Often, the stress driving our impulses is not a glaring catastrophe, but a subtle, persistent undercurrent of anxiety. Psychologists have discovered that even the unconscious fear of our own mortality can trigger massive spikes in impulsive behavior. When news reports, financial worries, or minor health scares remind us of our vulnerability, the brain panics and seeks immediate comfort, frequently leading to overeating, impulsive shopping, or other indulgences. The terror management theory explains that we use gratification as a psychological shield against the existential dread of our own fragility. To counter this, a crucial willpower experiment is to try a stress relief strategy that actually works. The tragedy of dopamine-driven coping mechanisms is that they do not genuinely relieve stress. They only temporarily mask it, often leaving us feeling more anxious and guilty afterward. True recovery requires shifting to activities that actively calm the nervous system and increase heart rate variability.
Scientifically proven stress relief strategies include physical exercise, spending time in nature, reading, listening to music, engaging in creative hobbies, or spending quality time with loved ones. These activities do not promise a sudden, euphoric high. Rather, they gently dismantle the physiological state of stress, returning the brain to a place of clarity and balance where self-control becomes possible again. Consider the transformation of a late-night snacker who goes on a TV diet. This individual believed that watching several hours of television every evening was her only way to unwind after a high-pressure job. However, the television did not genuinely relax her. It left her mildly stimulated and emotionally numb, a state that inevitably led to mindless overeating. When she recognized that her chosen method of relaxation was actually a trigger for her stress and subsequent snacking, she replaced the screen time with genuine restorative practices like a warm bath and reading. By changing how she managed her exhaustion, the urge to binge eat simply evaporated, proving that resolving the underlying stress is far more effective than fighting the resulting craving. This dynamic becomes acutely visible when we examine the what the hell effect, why guilt doesn't work. This psychological phenomenon occurs when an individual experiences a minor lapse in self-control, perhaps eating a single piece of cake while on a strict diet. Instead of simply acknowledging the slip and moving on, the individual is overwhelmed by guilt and a sense of total failure. The psychological distress of this perceived failure triggers the brain's stress response, which, as we know, immediately demands comfort. The fastest way to soothe the pain of eating one piece of cake is, paradoxically, to eat the rest of the cake. The individual thinks, "What the hell? I've already blown my diet, I might as well enjoy myself." The initial lapse does not cause the binge. The profound guilt and self-loathing following the lapse cause the binge. To understand this, we must put under the microscope when setbacks happen. The next time you experience a failure of resolve, acutely observe your internal monologue. Do you instantly berate yourself, calling yourself weak, stupid, or pathetic? Does the voice in your head sound like a cruel dictator? This internal hostility does not motivate you to do better. It inflicts profound emotional pain, driving you straight into the arms of the very temptation you were trying to avoid. Breaking the what the hell cycle requires a radical departure from conventional wisdom. The antidote to self-sabotage is not harsher self-criticism, but profound self-compassion. Numerous psychological studies confirm that individuals who treat themselves with kindness and understanding after a failure are significantly more likely to regain their discipline and achieve their goals. Forgiveness removes the shame and anxiety that fuel the downward spiral. When you remove the emotional agony of a setback, you also remove the desperate need to comfort yourself with further indulgence. A powerful willpower experiment is to actively practice forgiveness when you fail. When a lapse occurs, instead of launching into a tirade of self-abuse, treat yourself exactly as you would treat a close friend who has just stumbled. Acknowledge your frustration, but remind yourself that failure is a universal human experience. Everyone struggles with self-control. By contextualizing your mistake within the broader human condition, you neutralize the toxic shame and preserve the emotional energy required to try again. This shift was monumental for a writer who challenges the voice of self-criticism. Plagued by chronic procrastination, he found himself trapped in a cycle of delaying his work, which led to intense self-hatred, which in turn made the prospect of writing so emotionally fraught that he procrastinated even more. His inner critic convinced him he was simply a lazy failure. His breakthrough came when he consciously chose to replace the self-flagellation with self-compassion. He acknowledged that the creative process is inherently difficult and frightening. By forgiving his past delays, he removed the anxiety associated with his desk, finally allowing him to sit down and produce the work he was capable of. Another trap born of feeling bad is resolving to feel good. Often, when we feel overwhelmed by our flaws or circumstances, we make massive, unrealistic resolutions. We vow to exercise every day, eliminate all sugar, or completely overhaul our finances. The act of making these grand declarations triggers a massive dopamine rush. We instantly feel optimistic, empowered, and in control. However, this high is entirely artificial. We are not making resolutions to change our behavior, we are making them purely to escape our current bad mood.
When the reality of the required effort inevitably sets in, the emotional high crashes. Because the resolution was never rooted in a realistic plan, we quickly abandon it, leading to another wave of guilt and starting the cycle anew. We must put under the microscope this habit of resolving to feel good. Are your ambitious goals actually strategies for mood repair? Do you use the fantasy of a perfect future self to avoid the discomfort of your present reality? Recognizing when a resolution is merely an emotional anesthetic helps us separate genuine commitment from fleeting wishful thinking. To counter this, a vital willpower experiment involves practicing optimistic pessimism for successful resolutions. Instead of simply basking in the rosy glow of setting a goal, you must deliberately anticipate the obstacles. Allow yourself to be optimistic about your ultimate destination, but ruthlessly pessimistic about the journey. Predict exactly when, where, and how you will be tempted to give up. By foreseeing these inevitable moments of weakness, you can formulate a concrete plan for how to handle them. When the setback occurs, it will not be a catastrophic shock that triggers the what the hell effect. It will be an expected challenge that you are fully prepared to navigate. The last word on this complex emotional landscape is that our society's obsession with guilt as a motivational tool is fundamentally destructive. Emotional distress drains our cognitive resources and weaponizes our desires. By summarizing the chapter conceptually, that stress and self-criticism directly fuel our worst impulses, we can stop fighting ourselves. Through genuine stress relief, profound self-forgiveness, and a realistic appraisal of the challenges ahead, we strip our negative emotions of their destructive power, paving the way for sustainable, compassionate self-mastery. Chapter 7. Putting the Future on Sale. The Economics of Instant Gratification. The human capacity to conceptualize the future is an evolutionary marvel. We possess the unique cognitive ability to simulate events that have not yet occurred, to plan for our retirement, to anticipate the consequences of our actions, and to invest years of effort into education or career building. We understand, logically and profoundly, that our long-term health, financial security, and personal fulfillment require present-day sacrifices. Yet, despite this magnificent neurological machinery, we constantly behave as if tomorrow does not matter. We trade the profound value of our future well-being for the fleeting, often hollow thrill of instant gratification. Behavioral economists refer to this phenomenon as delay discounting. The further away a reward is in time, the less our brains value it. If given the choice between receiving $50 today or $100 a year from now, a staggering majority will seize the immediate $50, essentially putting their future on a massive, irrational clearance sale. This internal dynamic is the ultimate battleground of self-mastery, the relentless conflict between the desires of our present self and the needs of our future self. To understand why we so easily abandon our long-term goals, we must examine what happens when we are blinded by reward. The discrepancy between our rational plans and our impulsive actions is deeply rooted in the brain's architecture. The primitive reward system, the dopamine-driven circuitry that compels us to seek pleasure, is profoundly nearsighted. It evolved in an environment where survival depended on seizing immediate calories and mating opportunities. It does not understand the abstract concept of a future decade. It only understands the visceral reality of right now. When an immediate temptation presents itself, a slice of pizza, a clearance sale, a digital distraction, this midbrain system erupts in activity, shouting its demands and flooding our consciousness with urgency. In contrast, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of our long-term planning, is cooler and more analytical. It can appreciate the value of a distant reward, but it often lacks the immediate chemical firepower to shout down the demanding primitive brain. The proximity of a temptation acts as a biological blindfold. As soon as the reward is directly in front of us, visible and available, the brain abruptly shifts its valuation, prioritizing the immediate thrill over the profound long-term prize. To counteract this biological blindness, we can employ a surprisingly simple yet profoundly effective cognitive intervention, the willpower experiment to wait 10 minutes. Because the primitive reward system is exclusively focused on immediate gratification, any mandatory delay drastically reduces its power. By instituting a strict rule that you must wait exactly 10 minutes before indulging in a temptation, you fundamentally alter how the brain processes the reward. During this brief window, the immediate dopamine rush begins to subside, cooling the physiological urgency of the craving. More importantly, this pause creates a critical space for the prefrontal cortex to re-engage. Once the reward is no longer instantly accessible, the brain stops treating it as an emergency and begins to view it as a future event. This levels the playing field, allowing your rational mind to objectively weigh the fleeting pleasure against your deeply held long-term goals. If, after 10 minutes of mindful consideration, you still choose the indulgence, you do so with intention, rather than as an automatic, blind reaction. Consider how the 10-minute rule helps a smoker cut back. A man who had struggled for years to quit smoking found that the traditional method of absolute denial merely amplified his cravings into a state of panic. The thought of never again was too overwhelming for his stressed brain to process. He shifted his strategy by giving himself unconditional permission to smoke, but with one rigid caveat. He had to wait 10 minutes after the initial urge struck. When the craving hit, instead of fighting it, he would set a timer. This subtle shift in framing was revolutionary. He was no longer depriving himself, he was merely delaying. The panic subsided. During those 10 minutes, he would consciously distance himself from the immediate environment and reflect on his desire for healthy lungs. By the time the timer expired, the acute, overwhelming wave of the craving had often passed, and he found he possessed the cognitive clarity to choose not to light the cigarette. The mandatory delay had rescued his prefrontal cortex from the tyranny of immediate demand. It is crucial to put your own choices under the microscope and ask, how are you discounting future rewards? We must critically examine the specific arenas in our lives where we are willing to trade massive future gains for trivial present comforts. Are you sacrificing the profound security of a well-funded retirement for the momentary thrill of discretionary shopping? Are you trading the vitality of long-term cardiovascular health for the immediate convenience of processed food and physical inactivity? We rarely make these transactions consciously. We mask them behind rationalizations and the comforting delusion that we will change our behavior tomorrow. By dragging these subconscious trade-offs into the light, we force ourselves to confront the true, staggering cost of our present impulses. To correct this imbalance, we must engage in a willpower experiment to lower your discount rate. This involves consciously changing how we frame the choices before us. When we face a temptation, we typically frame the decision as a binary choice between indulging now or denying ourselves. To lower the discount rate, we must reframe the decision to explicitly include the future consequence. Instead of asking, should I eat this dessert or not? The question must become, should I eat this dessert now, or should I choose the energy and health I want to possess next year? By actively visualizing the future reward and tying it directly to the present choice, we increase its psychological weight, making it significantly harder for the primitive brain to dismiss it as an abstract irrelevancy. This leads us to put another dangerous illusion under the microscope. Are you waiting for future you? One of the most insidious reasons we discount the future is a profound lack of empathy for the person we are going to become. Psychological studies utilizing brain imaging reveal a startling truth. When individuals are asked to think about their future selves, the neural regions associated with self-reflection remain entirely dark. Instead, the brain patterns resemble those activated when thinking about a complete stranger. Because we view our future selves as distinct, separate entities, we lack emotional connection to their struggles. We comfortably dump our current responsibilities, our debts, and our challenging diets onto this imaginary stranger, convinced that future you will somehow possess boundless energy, infinite discipline, and limitless free time. We use the fantasy of an idealized future self to license the laziness of our present self, completely ignoring the reality that we are the ones who will ultimately inherit the consequences of today's negligence. To protect our long-term interests from our present apathy, we can deploy a powerful willpower experiment. Pre-commit your future self. Also known as Ulysses contracts, this strategy involves making a binding decision in the present that actively restricts your options in the future. Because we know that our resolve will eventually falter when faced with temptation, we must arrange our environment so that changing our minds becomes exceedingly difficult, expensive, or humiliating. This might involve purchasing small, single-serving portions of food instead of bulk packages, automatically diverting a percentage of your paycheck into an inaccessible savings account before you ever see it, or publicly announcing a deadline to colleagues to leverage social pressure. Pre-commitment is the ultimate acknowledgement of our own fallibility. It is the act of the rational mind locking the doors before the impulsive mind has a chance to wander in. Yet as we analyze these strategies, we must also put a contrasting phenomenon under the microscope. Are you too far-sighted for your own good? While the majority of society struggles with instant gratification, a significant subset of individuals suffers from the exact opposite affliction. Known as hyperopia, this condition describes people who are so profoundly fixated on the future that they are entirely incapable of enjoying the present. They perpetually delay gratification, hoarding their money, overworking themselves, and refusing to indulge in even the most reasonable pleasures out of an irrational fear of future scarcity. For these individuals, the self-control mechanism has become tyrannical, robbing their lives of spontaneity, joy, and meaningful present connection. The goal of self-mastery is not absolute, ascetic denial. It is the deliberate, harmonious balance between taking care of tomorrow and living fully today. To heal the rift between who we are today and who we will become, the most vital willpower experiment is to actively meet your future self. If the root of delay discounting is treating our future selves like strangers, the cure is to cultivate profound empathy and familiarity with that future identity. Researchers have found that interventions designed to bridge this psychological gap, such as having participants interact with digitally aged avatars of themselves, or writing detailed, emotionally resonant letters to the person they will be in 20 years, drastically reduce impulsive behavior. When the future self ceases to be an abstract concept and becomes a vivid, emotionally real person whose well-being we deeply care about, the desire to sabotage them vanishes. We begin to make choices not out of a sense of punishing obligation, but out of genuine compassion for the person we are destined to become. The last word on this economic landscape of the mind is that time is the ultimate variable in the equation of self-control. Our failure to delay gratification is not a moral failing, it is a neurological miscalculation born of our evolutionary history. In closing this chapter summary, the core mechanism of our struggle is the brain's inability to properly value delayed rewards, leading us to continuously put our future on sale. By understanding how the immediate presence of a reward blinds our rational faculties, we can implement practical delays like the 10-minute rule to restore cognitive balance. We must confront the dangerous illusion that our future selves will magically solve the problems we create today, and instead use strategies like pre-commitment to secure our long-term goals. Ultimately, by cultivating a deep, empathetic connection with the future versions of ourselves, we can harmonize the demands of the present with the profound necessities of tomorrow.
Chapter 8. Infected. Why willpower is contagious. We often conceptualize the struggle for self-mastery as a deeply solitary endeavor. We imagine ourselves locked in an isolated internal battle between our highest aspirations and our basest impulses, as if our minds exist in a vacuum untouched by the outside world. Yet the profound reality of human biology and psychology shatters this illusion of independence. We are, at our core, intensely social creatures, and our brains are exquisitely wired to connect with, understand, and ultimately mimic the people around us. This neurological mandate for social cohesion means that willpower, and, conversely, the lack thereof, is highly contagious. We catch habits, both virtuous and destructive, from our communities just as easily as we might catch a seasonal cold. When we witness someone else succumb to temptation, our own resolve weakens. When we observe an act of profound discipline, our own capacity for restraint is magically fortified. To truly master our own behavior, we must expand our gaze beyond our own internal landscape and recognize the powerful, invisible currents of social influence that shape our every choice. The biological foundation of this social contagion lies in a specialized group of brain cells known as mirror neurons. Their sole function is to meticulously observe the actions, postures, and emotional states of others and subsequently recreate those exact experiences within our own neural circuitry. When you see someone reach for a cigarette, your mirror neurons physically simulate the act of reaching, subtly priming your own body to repeat the motion. More profoundly, if you see someone express the physical relief of indulging a craving, your brain mirrors that emotional state, artificially inducing a sympathetic craving within you.
This continuous, unconscious neurological mimicking is the glue of human empathy, allowing us to intuit the feelings and intentions of our tribe. However, in the context of self-discipline, this empathetic mirroring can become a profound vulnerability, transforming a personal resolve into a shared collapse. To understand this dynamic, we must put under the microscope your social network. The behaviors that define our lives are rarely contained within ourselves. They ripple through our social webs with startling predictability. Extensive longitudinal studies have mapped the spread of health outcomes, such as obesity, smoking cessation, and even happiness, across vast networks of people over decades. The findings are staggering. Your likelihood of developing a specific habit does not merely depend on your own choices, but is heavily dictated by the habits of your close friends, and even the friends of your friends. If a close associate begins to overeat or neglect their finances, the behavioral norms within your shared psychological space shift. The unacceptable subtly becomes acceptable. Take a critical inventory of your own social circles. Are the people you spend the most time with unknowingly acting as carriers for the very temptations you are desperately trying to resist? Recognizing the structural reality of your social environment is the first step toward reclaiming your autonomy within it. We must also put under the microscope, who are you mirroring? The influence of others is not a generalized phenomenon. We do not mimic everyone equally. We are selectively permeable to the behaviors of those we are currently observing or interacting with. This mimicry operates entirely beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. If you sit across from a colleague who is slouching, your own posture will unconsciously degrade. If you share a meal with someone who eats rapidly and consumes massive portions, your own pace and consumption will automatically increase to match theirs. Observe your own behavior in different social contexts. Notice how your language, your eating habits, and your impulsivity morph depending on who is in the room. Acknowledging that you are a neurological chameleon allows you to recognize when your desires are genuinely your own, and when they are merely reflections of the people around you. To protect your aspirations from this unconscious mimicry, you must employ a willpower experiment to strengthen your immune system. Just as a vaccine prepares the body to fight off an infection, you can psychologically inoculate yourself against the contagion of bad habits. The most effective defense against mimicking a destructive behavior is to fiercely activate your own goals right before you enter a high-risk social situation. If you know you are attending a gathering where alcohol will flow freely and you are trying to remain sober, take a deliberate moment of isolation beforehand. Vividly recall your primary motivation for sobriety. Visualize your commitment and the profound reasons behind it. By elevating the psychological prominence of your own values immediately before exposure, you occupy the neural pathways that would otherwise be hijacked by mirror neurons. Your brain becomes so deeply anchored to your own objective that the gravitational pull of the group's behavior loses its power. It is critical to put under the microscope who you are most likely to catch something from. The strength of behavioral contagion is inextricably linked to the depth of our emotional connection. We are not heavily influenced by strangers. Rather, we catch habits from the people we love, respect, and identify with. The closer the relationship, the more intensely our mirror neurons fire. This means that a spouse, a best friend, or a deeply admired mentor wields a terrifying amount of power over our own self-control. When someone we cherish normalizes a destructive behavior, it fundamentally rewires our own moral compass regarding that behavior. Evaluate your closest relationships. Recognize that your profound affection for these individuals makes you highly susceptible to their blind spots. You must learn to separate your love for the person from the adoption of their specific, detrimental choices. Conversely, this exact same mechanism can be harnessed for profound good through a willpower experiment to catch self-control. Just as temptation is contagious, so is discipline. The mere thought of an individual who possesses extraordinary willpower can instantly fortify our own resolve. When you find yourself facing an overwhelming challenge, actively summon the image of a role model, perhaps an athlete, a spiritual leader, or a highly disciplined family member. Ask yourself how they would navigate the exact temptation standing before you. This is not a mere intellectual exercise. Visualizing their disciplined behavior triggers your mirror neurons to simulate their restraint, effectively downloading a temporary dose of their willpower into your own nervous system. You can actively borrow strength from the tribe simply by choosing the right person to mentally emulate. Yet we must be deeply wary of a pervasive cognitive trap, putting under the microscope the belief that, but everyone else is doing it. We possess an intense evolutionary drive for social conformity. To be isolated from the tribe once meant certain death, so our brains are desperately attuned to the concept of social proof. If we believe that everyone is cheating on their taxes, skipping the gym, or eating junk food, our resistance entirely collapses. We use the perceived majority as a license to abandon our own standards. The danger is that our perception of everyone is often drastically skewed by the most visible, loudest behaviors in our environment, while the quiet acts of discipline go unnoticed. Challenge your assumptions about the norm. Do not allow the visible failures of the crowd to become the internal justification for your own surrender. To counter the pull of conformity, we can leverage our social instincts through a willpower experiment using the power of pride. For too long, we have relied on the anticipation of shame to keep us in line. We tell ourselves that we will feel terrible if we fail. However, shame is an isolating, energy-draining emotion that frequently drives us toward further indulgence to escape the pain. A far more potent and biologically motivating force is the anticipation of social pride. We are hardwired to crave the approval and admiration of our community. By publicly committing to a difficult goal or sharing your progress with a supportive network, you engage the powerful desire to be seen as capable and strong. When faced with a moment of weakness, imagining the profound satisfaction of reporting your success to people you respect can provide the critical surge of energy needed to overcome the impulse. The ultimate application of this social reality is a willpower experiment to make it a group project. The heaviest burdens become remarkably light when distributed across a collective. Attempting to overhaul a deeply ingrained habit alone is a brutal test of individual endurance. However, when a family, a workplace, or a community decides to tackle a willpower challenge together, the entire dynamic shifts. The very mirror neurons that once spread temptation now amplify discipline. A shared goal creates a culture of mutual accountability where every individual's success fortifies the resolve of the entire group. By transforming a solitary struggle into a shared tribal mission, you harness the immense ancient power of human connection to achieve what the isolated individual cannot. The last word on the social dimension of self-mastery is that we must abandon the myth of the solitary hero. Our environments and our communities are the invisible scaffolding of our behavior. We cannot ignore the profound ways in which our brains are tethered to the minds of those around us. The chapter summary reinforces that our capacity for self-control is continuously shaped by our social network. We unconsciously mirror the actions and desires of those we spend time with, particularly those we hold in high regard. By understanding this contagion, we can actively strengthen our psychological immune system against negative influences and deliberately catch discipline from inspiring role models. We must resist the destructive illusion of social proof that normalizes failure, and instead utilize the anticipation of pride and the profound strength of group commitment to elevate our collective resolve. Chapter 9. Don't read this chapter. The Limits of I Won't Power. There is a profound and intensely frustrating paradox built into the architecture of the human mind. The deliberate attempt to suppress a thought practically guarantees that it will dominate your consciousness. The harder you try to push an idea away, the more violently it forces its way back in. We frequently rely on the power of I won't to manage not only our behaviors but also our internal experiences. We command ourselves not to think about an ex-partner, not to dwell on an upcoming stressful presentation, or not to obsess over the chocolate cake in the refrigerator. We operate under the seemingly logical assumption that forbidding a thought will silence it. However, psychological mechanics dictate the exact opposite. This strategy of suppression backfires with devastating consistency, turning minor distractions into overwhelming obsessions. To genuinely master our impulses, we must recognize that the mental brute force required to silence our inner world is not just ineffective, it is actively destructive to our self-control. Under the microscope, investigating ironic rebound. This phenomenon of a suppressed thought returning with multiplied intensity is known as ironic rebound. It occurs because the brain employs a divided system when instructed to ignore something. One part of the mind actively redirects attention away from the forbidden thought, searching for distractions, Simultaneously, an unconscious monitoring system constantly scans the mind to ensure the forbidden thought has not returned. The tragedy is that this monitoring system keeps the very concept we are trying to avoid highly active in our neural circuitry. When cognitive fatigue sets in, as it inevitably does, the active distraction system fails, but the hyper-vigilant monitoring system remains engaged. The mind is suddenly flooded with the exact thought it was guarding against. To understand this vulnerability, you must observe it within your own consciousness. When you actively attempt to banish a specific worry, craving, or memory from your mind, acutely monitor the result. Notice how the act of suppression creates a pressurized psychological state where the forbidden thought seems to echo louder the harder you try to silence it. If I think it, it must be true. The danger of ironic rebound extends far beyond mere annoyance. It fundamentally distorts our perception of reality. The brain utilizes a dangerous heuristic. It assumes that the frequency and intensity of a thought correlate directly with its importance and truth. When thought suppression causes a craving or an anxiety to persistently intrude upon our awareness, the brain misinterprets this relentless repetition. Instead of recognizing the intrusion as a mechanical failure of the suppression system, the brain concludes that the thought must be a profound, undeniable revelation. If an individual tries not to think about eating a donut and the thought of the donut forcefully returns 20 times in an hour, the brain deduces that the body must be in a state of desperate, genuine starvation. The presence of the thought is mistaken for a mandate to act. We become terrified of our own minds, believing that our dark impulses, intense cravings, or anxious projections are absolute truths simply because we cannot stop thinking about them. Willpower experiment. Feel what you feel, but don't believe everything you think. To sever the link between a recurring thought and a destructive action, a radical shift in internal management is required. Instead of desperately fighting to suppress the thought, you must cultivate the ability to observe it with profound detachment. When a forbidden desire or a terrifying anxiety arises, do not attempt to push it away. Acknowledge its presence. Notice the specific narrative it is spinning in your mind. However, critically remind yourself that thoughts are merely fleeting neurological events, not objective realities or commands that must be obeyed. You can allow a craving to exist fully in your consciousness without identifying with it or believing the desperate logic it presents. By offering the thought space to exist without resistance, you eliminate the friction that causes ironic rebound. The thought is permitted to naturally arise, peak, and eventually pass away like a weather pattern moving through the sky without forcing you into an impulsive reaction. Under the microscope. What's on your most wanted list? This strategy demands absolute honesty about the specific internal experiences you are currently fighting a losing battle against. We all harbor a unique list of psychological fugitives, the specific emotions, memories, or cravings we exert massive energy trying to exile from our minds. Are you desperately trying to suppress the grief of a loss, the anger toward a colleague, or the intense biological urge for a destructive habit? The tragedy of the I won't power is that directing it inward toward our feelings transforms ordinary emotional discomfort into agonizing psychological torment. Identify the specific items on your internal most wanted list. Recognize that the energy you expend trying to keep these thoughts locked away is the exact energy keeping them alive and powerful. Willpower experiment. Accept those cravings, just don't act on them. The ultimate defense against an overwhelming impulse is a posture of radical acceptance. This concept often feels deeply counterintuitive, as we associate acceptance with surrender or giving in. However, accepting a craving does not mean fulfilling it. It means completely dropping the internal struggle against the feeling of the craving. When the desire strikes, imagine yourself stepping off a battlefield. Stop trying to argue with the urge, stop trying to logically dismantle it, and stop trying to distract yourself from it. Simply let the craving be exactly what it is, a profoundly uncomfortable physical and emotional sensation. Notice where it manifests in your body, perhaps a tightness in the chest, a restless energy in the limbs, or a tension in the jaw. By leaning into the discomfort rather than fleeing from it, you disarm the brain's panic response. The craving ceases to be an intolerable emergency requiring immediate gratification and becomes merely an intense sensation that you are entirely capable of enduring. Willpower experiment. Surf the urge. To operationalize this acceptance, you can employ a specific psychological technique known as surfing the urge. Cravings do not possess infinite energy. They operate like ocean waves. They begin as a subtle ripple, build in intensity until they reach a terrifying, towering peak, and then, inevitably, they break and dissipate. When we fight the wave, we are pulled under and drowned by it. Surfing the urge requires you to ride the wave using the breath as a stabilizing anchor. When the craving peaks and the mind screams that you must give in or suffer endlessly, direct your entire focus to the physical sensation of breathing. Inhale slowly and deeply, and as you exhale, imagine yourself floating on top of the intense sensation. You do not try to flatten the wave, you merely balance upon it, trusting the biological certainty that the intensity will eventually crash and recede. By repeatedly surviving the peak of an urge without acting on it, you train your brain to recognize that a craving is not a command but a temporary phenomenon that can be safely outlasted. Willpower experiment. Turn your I won't into I will, because the mind cannot effectively process the concept of an absence. Building a goal entirely around what you are forbidden to do is a neurological trap. To bypass the mechanisms of ironic rebound, you must translate your restrictive goals into proactive pursuits. If your objective is to stop eating junk food, your brain will obsess over junk food. You must reframe the challenge. What positive action will you take instead? Perhaps the goal becomes a relentless pursuit of consuming high-quality, nourishing foods. If the goal is to stop procrastinating, the focus must shift entirely to the profound, engaging pursuit of the task at hand. By defining your objective by what you will do, rather than what you won't do, you give your brain a concrete target to focus its energy upon. You redirect the massive power of your attention away from the forbidden temptation and channel it toward the construction of a new, positive reality. The last word. The deepest revelation regarding self-mastery is that we possess astonishingly little control over the spontaneous thoughts and emotions that enter our minds, yet we possess absolute authority over how we choose to respond to them. The belief that a pure, disciplined life requires a flawlessly quiet and perfectly pure mind is a destructive illusion. True self-control is the profound ability to experience the full, chaotic spectrum of human desire and anxiety, to feel the intense pull of temptation, and to calmly choose a different path regardless. Chapter summary. The central thesis of this exploration is that applying the power of denial to our internal landscape is fundamentally flawed. Thought suppression actively triggers ironic rebound, causing the forbidden desires to return with overwhelming force and tricking the brain into believing these amplified thoughts are absolute truths. To navigate this internal terrain, we must transition from a strategy of forceful suppression to one of mindful observation. By identifying the specific thoughts and feelings we desperately try to avoid, we can practice radical acceptance, allowing the sensations of a craving to wash over us without demanding action. By mastering the art of surfing the urge, riding out the temporary peak of physical and emotional discomfort, we strip temptations of their emergency status. Finally, by consistently reframing our restrictive boundaries into positive, proactive goals, we align our neurological focus with our highest aspirations, proving that true power lies not in controlling what we think, but in mastering what we do. Chapter 10. Final thoughts. The culmination of this rigorous scientific and deeply personal exploration brings us to a fundamental, perhaps unexpected truth. The quest for flawless, absolute self-mastery is a destructive illusion. Throughout this journey, we have navigated the complex neurological battlegrounds of our own minds, exposing the sophisticated deceptions our brains employ to secure immediate comfort at the expense of our ultimate well-being. We have dissected the anatomy of our impulses, revealing how the modern world expertly hijacks our ancient biology. We have seen how the promise of reward masquerades as happiness, how the heavy burden of guilt inevitably weaponizes our desires, and how the invisible currents of social contagion quietly erode our deepest resolves. It is easy, when confronted with the sheer magnitude of these biological and psychological forces, to feel overwhelmed. Yet, the true objective of understanding the science of willpower was never to transform you into an unfeeling, perfectly disciplined automaton, immune to temptation and forever marching in a straight line toward your goals. Such an existence is neither possible nor inherently desirable. The true essence of human strength lies not in the complete eradication of our impulses, but in the profound, evolving practice of self-awareness. The most powerful tool you possess is the simple, radical act of paying attention. It is the ability to pause in the critical space between a powerful craving and an automatic reaction. It is the capacity to notice the physical tension of stress masquerading as a desire for indulgence, to recognize the subtle mental accounting that licenses a bad decision, and to catch the mind in the act of trading a profound future for a hollow present. This awareness is the very activation of the prefrontal cortex. It is the biological manifestation of your highest self stepping into the light to guide the primitive mind. As you step forward, you must embrace the mindset of a dedicated, compassionate scientist in the laboratory of your own life. A scientist does not view a failed experiment as a moral catastrophe. They view it as vital data. When you inevitably stumble, when you skip the workout, lose your temper, or surrender to the temptation you swore you would resist, you must abandon the role of the cruel judge. Harsh self-criticism will only trigger the very stress response that guarantees your next failure. Instead, you must look closely at the mechanics of your misstep. What was the trigger? What was the physiological state of your body? What was the precise lie your brain told you to justify the surrender? By examining your vulnerabilities with deep curiosity rather than toxic shame, you continuously refine your understanding of your own nature, ensuring that every setback becomes the architectural blueprint for your future resilience. Ultimately, the power to change your life does not reside in a sudden magical surge of unyielding discipline. It is found in the quiet, persistent remembrance of your deepest values. Amidst the relentless clamor of your I will obligations and the desperate protests of your I won't restrictions, it is your I want power that must serve as your unwavering compass. When you are firmly anchored to what you truly desire, whether it is vibrant health, profound connection, or the realization of a lifelong ambition, the friction of daily temptation loses its terrifying grip. You are no longer fighting against your own nature, you are simply making choices that honor the person you are actively becoming. The journey of self-mastery is entirely without an endpoint. It is a continuous, lifelong dialogue between the competing facets of your humanity. Keep your attention sharp, keep your heart fiercely compassionate toward your own struggles, and never lose sight of the profound aspirations that make the effort entirely worthwhile.